I'd like to briefly explain the basics of modularization, which can of course be applied to more sophisticated and complex programs. But for the purpose of this video, where I simply explain the basics, I'd like to sort of touch on sort of the very simplistic approach or a trivial example which can sort of stress what modularization is and how something like that could look. And so essentially what we find often is that our main method, as you can see between these two braces here, sort of gets decluttered and it's very hard to read or debug. And so in order to solve this particular problem, we can break the program into segments. Now, if I had, let's say, a program which takes two numbers, right? That's one part. It takes two numbers and it adds those numbers and stores it in a variable called answer, and then sort of prints out the answer. This can be considered as a small little program which can be very conveniently confined between these two braces in the main method. We could, of course, make two integer variables, make an integer called answer, initialize those variables, and store it in answer and print it out. But with modularization, we want to think of this as sort of being sort of each segment or anything that we can divide can take on a method of its own, and then it can contribute to a larger framework and sort of interact with the main method. And so taking two numbers can be a method, adding those numbers can be a method, storing it in a variable called answer, well, that could be sort of part of a method, right? We could return an answer. And we can print out the answer, of course, which can be its own method. And so in order to sort of do this here, we could make a static void, and this is just taking those two numbers or returning two numbers. We can take a static void get number function, which is nothing but a method which will get a number. And what we want is we want it to return a number. And so we're going to sort of make clear the fact that our return type is going to be an integer because we're going to return a number. And so it's giving me an error here because it knows that I actually have to return something within a method which says that it will return something. And so if I sort of after my program or my method is done, I'm going to return, let's say, a particular number. First and foremost, I'm going to need a scanner to actually ask the user for a number to enter in. After I do that, I can sort of ask them directly, which is actually called prompting the user. And I can say, please enter a number. Then I can actually have, before all of this, I can actually have a integer called number, and that can be initialized in the after I ask them, using the scanner, of course. Or I could just do, sort of do int number, which would achieve the same thing in a more concise manner. And then I return the number which they put. And so by now, it becomes clear that I've achieved one purpose. And so here, within my main method, I can have two numbers, let's say number 1, and I could have, let's say, number 2. And what this will do is what I want number 1 to be whatever the user inputs. So I'm going to sort of invoke the getNumber method, which will essentially send the program back down into this method, ask the user for a number, and whatever number they input, it will return that number and store it within this number. And so now my number 1 is the number that they entered. And this, of course, gets repeated for number 2. So now I have two numbers that the user has entered, which are actually sort of segmented off in another part of the program, which I can later sort of pay attention to if anything goes wrong. Now I want to add those numbers. Ideally, what I'd like to do is I would like to have an integer called answer in my main method, and I would like to set answer equal to a method which actually takes in one number, and well, let's just, it will take in num1, so So essentially what I want it to do is it will take in number 1 and number 2 as parameters. And so I should be able to pass in number 1 and number 2, and it should be able to return back the sum of these numbers. So let me go off here and create another method which can do that. So I use the keyword static because it's not attached to an object, it's a standalone. And I'm going to return an integer, so I sort of make that clear in my method signature, and I call the method sum. Recall that I actually want to return two numbers, and so I also make that clear as well. I've named this number 1 and number 2, but they're actually not supposed to be confused for the number 1 and number 2 in this part of the program. Everything in the main method exists within its closest brackets, and everything within this particular sum method exists within its closest brackets. And so number 1 and number 2 are actually entirely different variables than these variables, but passing number 1 and number 2, which are in my main method, into the sum method sort of treat these as if it were these. And so this is sort of a placeholder. The sum method sort of says that it needs something. It needs any number or any two numbers, which are integers, to be passed in, which will of course later be these two numbers. And so here, what I do is I'm going to have the method sum is going to have an answer, and it's going to essentially store number 1 plus number 2 inside answer. And it's essentially just going to return that answer. And so by now, it becomes clear that I can simply pass in these two numbers and it will return the sum of these two numbers. I also want to sort of print out the answer. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have my own method here. It's going to be void because it's not going to return anything. It's just going to print something out. It's going to be called print. And so essentially print is just going to, it's going to take in any integer. Again, this is just a placeholder for something else in the future. And then it's just going to print out that integer. I could even call this any int if I wanted to, just to make it clear that this answer is not actually the same thing as this answer. So when I do that, and I have my own version of answer inside the main method, I can actually just say answer is equal to printing out what my answer is inside the main method. Or actually, I don't have to equate it to anything. I just want to print out whatever this returns. And so doing so will allow me to enter two numbers and actually getting back their sum. Now on the right hand side here, there's actually an outline which outlines what methods I've made and sort of what parameters they take. And so here you can see the sum method takes in two integers, which are again not to be confused with the integers that we find in the main method. But they are of course later on equated to the same value. This one takes an integer, the print method, which essentially just prints out any integer you put in. We use this method later on in the main method, and then we print out answer, which is actually equated to the sum of these two numbers, which were acquired with the sum method. The numbers themselves were acquired with the getNumber method, which essentially utilized a scanner and asked for a number, and then returned a number, which were then equated to the numbers we had in our main method. And so that's how we can use modularization to segment our program. And if we had any problem, then we could refer back to these little methods and what their tasks are, and then really judge them as standalone pieces of the code, which can be given more proper attention because there's not too much inside them.